Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm Ivo Dalder, the president of the Chicago Council, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity here today to have Undersecretary Sarah Sewall with us to talk about preventing mass atrocities, not an unimportant subject for anyone, and no one better to talk about it than Sarah Sewall. In 2012, the Atrocities Prevention Board was created by President Obama to coordinate the efforts and establish new initiatives in preventing mass atrocities around the world. Thus far, the focus has been on in the fall of 2014 on Iraq's Yazidi population, which was targeted by ISIS. As we all remember, a year before that, the focus was on the Central African Republic and escalating tensions in Burundi. I look forward, and I hope all of you do too, to hear more about the work of the board, to see how the board can work within the U.S. government and across the international community to prevent what we have seen all too often in the world, mass atrocities of a scale that no one wants to see happen again, and the board is designed to help make it possible that it doesn't happen again. As you know, we are live streaming this, so this is on the record. You may tweet, you may Facebook, whatever else it is that you do, as long as you turn your phone to vibrate or silent. I'm very pleased to welcome back, and actually welcome, not back to me, because Sarah and I go back a long time, but welcome here to Chicago, Sarah Sewall, who was appointed to her current position as Undersecretary of State in February 2014. And no one better to talk about this, not only because of her current position, but of all the long and hard work Sarah has done over the many years to deal with human rights, to deal with prevention of major conflicts, including major conflicts involving large-scale atrocities of human beings. She was the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, where she established the Mass Atrocity Response Operations Project with the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and indeed under those auspices, Sarah came to Brussels to see whether NATO could do something about that. I'm not sure we responded in the way that you wanted us to respond, but we tried. In 2012, she was the U.S. Naval War College Minerva Chair, and currently, as Undersecretary of State, also serves as Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues. Please, at this point, join me in welcoming Sarah Sewall to the Chicago Council.
Well, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, Ambassador Dalder, for your introduction. And a warm welcome here. I've never spoken at the Chicago Council, so I've heard about you a lot in the East Coast. We hear about you a lot. I just want you to know that, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. And it's a particular pleasure to have a chance to tell Ambassador Dalder that he is missed in Washington. We are always grateful for being able to benefit from your strong leadership at NATO, but I think you played a pivotal role in so many issues that are still live. It's very fortunate that this community can benefit from your experiences as you lead discussions on current and future issues. One of the things that Ivo and I have shared throughout our careers has been a profound reality of being shaped by U.S. responses to mass atrocity and failures to respond to mass atrocity over the years. I served in DOD in the early 1990s in the Clinton administration during the time of the Rwandan genocide, during the time of the Bosnian Civil War. Ivo literally wrote the book on the NATO air campaign to protect Kosovars. We both share, as any keen observer of U.S. foreign policy over recent decades must, a deep appreciation for the costs and the complexities and the unintended consequences of military interventions to protect civilians from mass slaughter. And it is that awareness of those costs that logically drives one as a public servant or as an intellectual observer to the conclusion that prevention of mass atrocities is far preferable than responding. And it's really that topic that brought me to Chicago today to talk with you a little bit about what it is that the U.S. government as a whole and that the State Department in particular has been seeking to do to more fully realize the President's commitment to which Ivo just referred, his commitment to address mass atrocities against civilians as not only a moral responsibility, but as a matter of national security. So he committed some 3 years ago to making the United States, President Obama committed to making the United States a global leader in helping to prevent large-scale violence against civilians worldwide. And in the vein that I just mentioned, he made it clear that the United States cannot and should not intervene militarily every time there is an injustice or an immediate threat of atrocities. He called instead for the United States to use its full arsenal of tools, diplomatic, political, financial, intelligence, law enforcement, to prevent these terrible crimes. And as one such tool that he wished to create, he created the Atrocities Prevention Board. It's referred to in government bureaucratic speak as the APB, but it was designed as a way to put in practice his commitment to elevating attention to the prevention of mass atrocities. And the way this body works, it's a decision-making group. I'm the U.S. State Department representative there. It meets regularly to scan the horizon for emerging mass atrocities threats. And I should say that it is guided in this respect by some important changes that have occurred within our intelligence community, which has now developed the tools to identify mass atrocity threats. And the Atrocity Prevention Board, together across the executive branch, seeks to prioritize them and to develop strategies to mitigate those risks of mass violence against civilians. It's not meant to replace the functioning of normal bureaucratic processes, which I won't bore you with the details of, but it's ancillary. It's not designed to take over all U.S. government decision-making through the atrocity prevention lens. It is designed to speed up the cogs of government policymaking and to fill voids and throw up yellow flags where our normal processes may not be sufficiently prioritizing or anticipating the threat of mass atrocities. And as such, and this is sometimes difficult in light of the board's name, it's important to articulate that the Atrocities Prevention Board was never imagined as a singular solution to mass killings around the globe. And it was, as I said, meant to augment existing processes, prompting coordination among the larger national security apparatus to better address problems early on and recognize warning signs. Its comparative advantage is in focusing on potential or ongoing violence that might escape attention in existing foreign policy fora, rather than expending its energy on cases where the threats to civilians, think Assad's brutalities against the Syrian people, are already well recognized within the U.S. government and the subject of extensive work in regionally focused policy discussions. The comparative advantage of focusing on the early warning and preventive side is not simply that you are able to avoid the massive costs and unexpected consequences that I just detailed, which are inevitable in any response operation, but you also have additional time to both apply your own interventions and to encourage others to join you in an international preventive response. And I think there are some important examples in which getting ahead of the curve have enabled us to enlist partners in work that is fundamentally, on the diplomatic side, much more effective when it's conducted multilaterally. Another benefit is that when threats emerge, we have greater likelihood of trying to identify tools, technical expertise, and occasionally financial assistance from across the U.S. government. Ivo can attest to this, but one of the real challenges, and I'll allude to this or speak to this directly toward the end of my remarks, in the U.S. government is finding resources in a short time frame to intervene. And whether you're talking about diplomatic resources or programmatic resources or simply the ability to send people out to post, to work at an individual level, time is really critical because the U.S. government is not as swift as we would like it to be. And so the prevention approach also allows us to better utilize the sometimes cumbersome bureaucratic processes within which we are forced to work. So on the third anniversary of the Atrocity Prevention Board's creation, we are invigorated by our government's progress in highlighting atrocity prevention and mainstreaming it into the foreign policy process and institutionalizing the capabilities, analyses, and expertise that we need in order to do prevention work. I've been in my job for a little over a year. Since coming to the role of Undersecretary for Civilian Security, I have worked to strengthen the State Department's internal responses to the threat of mass atrocities and to build a closer relationship with state's primary partner in prevention, the U.S. Agency for International Development. I have redirected the focus of one of the bureaus in the Undersecretariat, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, which is now dedicated to providing expertise in formal analysis, planning, and coordination role in support of the Atrocity Prevention Board priorities. And as the hub for the State Department's prevention work, the CSO Bureau works with USAID to provide joint assessments of the drivers of conflict in a targeted set of countries, as well as to do the corresponding risk assessments and programmatic developments. And this new analytic atrocities assessment framework allows CSO to work with the department's regional bureaus to develop evidence-based, civilian-focused intervention options, which include diplomatic, programmatic, multilateral, and economic efforts. It's bureaucratic speak, but this is what institutionalizing changes in U.S. foreign policy requires. And CSO is developing a growing collection of best practices that are informing more targeted, effective government responses. And the APB, by virtue of being an intragovernmental entity, is really helping to facilitate this kind of institutionalization within other bureaus within the department. But at state, because it has so many different actors that are involved in atrocity prevention, we've created our own anti-atrocities coordination group to help facilitate the State Department's work in at-risk countries on an ongoing basis, and to engage with the regional experts who know the political, regional, and subnational dynamics best, linking them up with the functional expertise of the Conflict and Stabilization Office. And this allows us to better chart the course for institutionalizing atrocity prevention in our longer-term programming, where we're dealing with a 2-year budget cycle and trying to think out ahead of the curve in an area in which that prevention, the identification of risks is not always on a 2-year cycle. And we have also strengthened our work with embassies, which is, of course, the front lines of where a lot of this atrocity prevention work happens, certainly in near-term context. These frontline officers are the first to be able to identify the early warning signs as we look at places where we may have missed opportunities to act earlier. In historical terms, we can often see that those signs, had people been trained to recognize them, might have been elevated earlier. We're now training Foreign Service officers as a part of their professional development to better identify the risk factors that have been identified. And we have asked Chief of Missions, as part of the APB's reaching out to the field. In certain cases, we involve posts very directly in doing the atrocity risk assessments and, of course, in doing the program development. Because this is bureaucratic speak and because it's very abstract, I want to give you a couple of examples to help you understand how this is working in practice and why, even though we have not now prevented genocide and mass atrocities around the globe, why I think the path that we are on is a positive one, and why we are getting closer to realizing President Obama's goal. When Department of Atrocity Prevention watchers, because there now really is a community of people who consider themselves responsible for this work within the department and across the U.S. government. When that atrocity prevention community began to grow concerned about the escalating tensions in Burundi, they sounded the alarm. And I'm not talking about Burundi today, although we have a separate set of concerns about Burundi today, and I'll come back to that. But this was over a year ago. But those concerns were brought to the Atrocity Prevention Board. The board, linked with Post, agreed to send out a state USAID assessment team. They pulled together regional and functional experts within the government. They went out and did a thorough analysis of the risks for violence in the country, led to the development of a broad strategy and then execution of that strategy, which had diplomatic engagement and programmatic interventions that the embassy in Bujumbura, under the leadership of a very able ambassador, carried out. And the APB process, by virtue of saying, these are the risks and these are the programs that we need to mitigate those risks, was able to help identify additional sources of financing to make those programmatic interventions possible. Something that, as I said, is not always a simple prospect within the U.S. bureaucracy the way it works, coming from both state and AID. And those U.S.-funded projects provided a host of different interventions tied toward the risk assessment. They included conflict resolution training for community leaders that had previously been identified, supporting a saving and lending program that improved economic opportunities for the vulnerable youth that were considered to be among the core communities likely to become involved in the violence, and empowering civil society partners to monitor hate speech to allow for rapid interventions early on as they emerged. And this funding also allowed for a prevention advisor to be sent out to work closely with the Post in advance of the elections in May. And as we look at what was enabled by virtue of elevating, small African country to a higher level of priority within a U.S. foreign policy process that is riddled with extremely high priorities and crises happening all over the globe, we can see that 2-year period of time in which we were doing things differently than we would have had we been doing business as usual and hoping that violence hadn't broken out, that not only we can't take credit for having seen that Burundi has not had huge outbreaks of violence over the past 2 years, but we have certainly put in place activities that have, we believe, contributed to that outcome, and we are in a much better place as we look at the potential for violence breaking out any time now, because we're expecting the decision on Saturday, I believe, about the third term of the current president. We're in a much better position to respond than we would have been otherwise. We remain deeply concerned about the tensions in that country. We have to be vigilant as we continue urging the president to respect the 2-term limit that was agreed on pursuant to the Arusha Accords, and we will be on high alert from an atrocities prevention standpoint, certainly well through the elections, which we hope will be peaceful and credible. And we will continue to engage the networks of civil society and political leaders that we have to encourage the peaceful conduct of elections. We've warned everyone that we have identified as being a potential spoiler in this context that they would not be welcome in the United States were they to foment or engage in mass atrocities, and that we are prepared to deny visas to all who we are able to identify as having ordered, planned, or participated in acts of violence. And we'll continue to monitor the situation closely to prevent, mitigate, and address violence. And this is a template for what can happen when we are sufficiently seized of and able to identify and address and then respond to the early warning signs in a way that that elevates them in a world that's full of a lot of alarming signals. Related example, as Ivo referred to, Central African Republic. December 2013 was when we saw a rapid escalation of violence, and the APB experts worked again hand in hand with regional bureaus to identify key interventions. Working together, we were able to cobble together about $100 million in peacekeeping and security assistance, over $30 million worth of conflict mitigation, reconciliation, justice, accountability, and governance interventions. It's funded everything from community and grassroots peace and reconciliation programs to the purchase of vehicles for peacekeeping forces. And this is in addition to the 450 million plus U.S. contributions to the UN peacekeeping mission in that country. The funding there has been married with a host of diplomatic efforts, to include a special representative being named for that particular conflict, and President Obama's personal involvement in transmitting a peace message on local radio stations that played throughout the country at the height of the crisis. So a combination, resources, but also the non-monetary contributions, that sense of closely watching and closely monitoring and being prepared to respond. A related example of the APB's catalytic and also in some cases supporting rather than necessarily leading role would be the role of the APB in strengthening our response to atrocity prevention as it pertains to the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And it's so the whole Central African region, I think, is benefiting now from great attention there. Over the past 3 years, AAU Regional Task Force with DoD logistics and support from Special Operations Forces and U.S. civilian liaisons has now removed 3 of the LRA's top 5 most senior and notorious commanders. U.S. worked with leaders from the task force's member countries to ensure that LRA number 2 commander Dominique Ongwen, who was transferred to the ICC in January, faced justice. And we continue to offer up to $5 million in rewards for information leading to the arrest, transfer, or conviction of LRA leader Joseph Kony. And we've seen during that time that defections and releases from the LRA have significantly increased, over 250 individuals laying down their arms and leaving the LRA, and the number of people that have been killed by the LRA has decreased by 75%. Over that time. The number of displaced has fallen by 2/3, lowest number in a decade. Still too high, but progress. Obviously, when we think about the international coalition that is fighting against ISIL or Daesh, the U.S. focus there has been through a counterterrorism lens. In that context, I think everybody recognizes that terrorism has enormous impacts on civilians. But through the atrocity prevention lens, the APB has supported what is a central focus of U.S. foreign policy and national security activities, with particular attention to areas where civilians are being slaughtered. And we didn't have to raise attention to ISIL atrocities, but we were able to focus the U.S. on opportunities where it could make a huge impact in terms of saving civilian lives and preventing killings in large numbers. The best example there is when ISIL drove some tens of thousands of Yazidis, Iraqi religious minority, from their homes. When the APB was able to help ensure a swift U.S. government response by working with the embassy and consulates in Iraq, along with the State Department's Religious Freedom Office, to collect credible information from Yazidis on the ground. And that information, by ensuring that it made its way to the U.S. military chain of command, was able to inform U.S. decisions and strikes that degraded ISIL's capabilities and enabled local Kurdish military forces to break the siege and free the Yazidis from Mount Sinjar. More recently and less dramatically, but I think certainly equally importantly, the APB played a critical role in elevating the U.S. response to elevating U.S. prevention efforts in anticipation of potential violence in Nigeria pursuant to their national elections. And we had focused very heavily through the APB on Nigeria, largely in the context of Boko Haram and the emerging or the continuing threat in the Northeast. But as elections loomed and as we became more concerned about the potential for mass violence there, the APB worked hand in glove with the Africa Bureau and others throughout the government to really build a very fulsome strategy for intervening, primarily through diplomatic tools, but also on a multilateral level, to include a lot of partners that don't want to necessarily be known to have engaged, but engaged very usefully to pressure all parties involved in the elections and all parties believed to be critical players in the potential for mass violence to make public pledges to avoid violence, to know that they would be held accountable were violence to occur, and to constantly reiterate the international community's expectations of a peaceful We had been forewarned by a vote in which over 800 had died. But there were many reasons to fear that the potential for violence in this latest round could be dramatically worse. And so I think it was a really terrific example, again, building in part on our lessons from Burundi, of how we can galvanize the interagency and the international partners to really put a microscopic focus on an area that we believe has the potential to be catastrophic. I could talk at length about the interplay between countering violent extremism and mass atrocities and the ways in which the atrocity prevention work intersects with our work to prevent violent extremism. But I want to stop here and just wrap up so that we can have more of a discussion. I think the key points that I would like to leave you with is that we have begun to take this prevention approach that we have institutionalized within state and are trying to mainstream in our normal practices, and we are trying to share them with like-minded partners, whether they are European allies, whether they are our regional institutions. You know, our civilian security and development dialogue with the EU now has an atrocity prevention element within it. We're trying to sort of take the goodness of what we have done by way of putting atrocity prevention into the sinews of our normal practices and share those so that others can join in that process and echo it as appropriate. We continue to face, as we think about prevention as a foreign policy challenge, I'll be honest, resource constraints are a huge issue. Any government, any bureaucracy, any individual tends to respond to crises. It's very hard to budget and to prioritize prevention work. We know this from our own personal experience as well as experience in large organizations. Difficult to preserve and protect the freedom to take action in advance of the apparent crisis that galvanizes response. And this is an area in which I think we can continue to improve how the United States organizes itself and allows for the preventive work to find an easier route to the resources that it needs. But it's very difficult to do in an area where there is so much that is urgent as well as important. The value of acting before crises escalate is very clear, and everyone can agree on it in theory. In practice, it's more difficult to protect those resources, particularly when resources are as limited as they feel to those of us that are engaged in foreign policy work in a world that seems to only need U.S. engagement more than ever. And I want to close by noting that some observers, particularly when told that there is such a thing as an atrocity prevention board, express dissatisfaction with such a thing. And they note, quite rightly, that mass atrocities have not ended around the globe. And I understand this perspective. The APB has not stopped all violence in the last 3 years, and it has not been able to protect every civilian from government or insurgents or terrorists. But as imperfect as these efforts that we're making are, they do represent undeniable progress, both in prioritizing atrocity prevention and in delivering concrete results, even though it's very hard to prove the negative or to demonstrate that the dog did not bark. And I have to be very careful in talking about what we do as opposed to necessarily claiming an outcome. But I am convinced that on the APB's third anniversary, we're much closer to realizing the President's intent that the United States government embrace the mission of preventing mass atrocities. And it's my hope that 3 years from now, the United States will have made, in its tools, with its resource allocations, and in its actions, even more effective in preventing mass violence against civilians. If you think in the historical sweep about President Obama's commitment, it was an extremely bold one. It was bold to elevate concern about mass atrocities as a foreign policy priority. And he said it's not just a matter of values, but a core national security interests. He noted that it's tempting to hold up our hands and resign ourselves to man's endless capacity for cruelty, particularly in the world of today where there is so much. But Elie Wiesel and other Holocaust survivors have shown us that you must choose to never give up. The United States of America certainly can't, and I'm pleased to be with you today to talk about how that challenge both draws on our deepest reserves of values, but also calls us to the broadest interpretation of our interests on behalf of the global community. So thank you.
Sarah, thanks very much for that that overview of what the APB, the Atrocity Prevention Board, has been doing over the last 3 years. And as you said, it's difficult to measure cause and effect, but undeniably putting more attention of the U.S. government on these kinds of issues early on will have some impact. Let me start off with a couple of questions and open up, if that's okay. First is what's a mass atrocity? When do you know, what is it that you're trying to prevent? Is it 10, 15, 20, 30? So how does the APB think about a mass atrocity and when you try to prevent that?
So there's questions about a legal definition of a mass atrocity and then a political definition of a mass atrocity. I will say
That's on.
in response to your question, Ivo, the way the APB thinks about it is that an atrocity is a killing of unarmed civilians of some 500 or more over a sustained period of time, that a mass atrocity is larger than that. But I will tell you that we don't spend a lot of time debating it, because if you're in the prevention business, then you're not going to wait for the threshold. And the idea is to simply have some sense of what the potential is so that you can prioritize where your interventions are most necessary. And that sounds difficult and somewhat crass, I suppose, but in a world in which there is so much violence, we need to have a way to screen and prioritize where we are going to really focus our attention. And so the threshold is generally not where we're focusing on, because we're looking at what could be the outer limit, and we are relying on our best guesses based on history or based on our assessment of risk factors as to where the most people could be at risk.
A Washington question. You mentioned resources a lot. How does Congress react to the establishment of the APB, and is there more willingness now, because this is an issue that unites all Americans, but is there a willingness to put resources behind it?
Well, we'll see. I've been in this role for a year. I've just started talking to members of Congress about the Atrocity Prevention Board and its potential and its challenges. I think you're absolutely right. It's a bipartisan issue. I don't think there is a single member of Congress that doesn't think that this is important, and I think that the prevention argument is an extremely compelling one. So I am very hopeful that we will see Congress increasingly willing to try to protect resources for prevention purposes, even as we recognize that there are plenty of ongoing crises that we continue to need to be able to respond to.
Great. Let me open it up. Raise your hand, and we will get you a mic. Because we are taping this, it's important that you speak into the mic, and it's even more important that you ask a question when you do get the mic. So we'll go right here, Eric.
Thank you so much for coming and talking about this. My question kind of ties into this idea that atrocity prevention is a core strategic mission. I think that's an excellent way to put it. Have there been any instances where that work has run up against other core strategic interests of the United States? And in those instances, how does that tension end up kind of relieving itself?
typically when people think about humanitarian intervention, they think about it as a matter of saving other people's lives, and they put it in the category of morality and values. And so what I think is so significant about President Obama's reframing of the potential for mass atrocities to affect U.S. national security interests is the recognition that it's not a values versus interests trade-off, that often values and interests are hand in hand. That doesn't answer the question of what is a highest value at any point in time, and it's going to vary. It's going to vary. And one of the things that the president made clear in the context of the Libya coalition activity in which Ambassador Dalder was so intimately involved is that there will be circumstances in which it is sensible for us, where we have a unique role to play, where we have a finite mission to carry out, whether the circumstances enable us to make a significant contribution militarily, but that will not be true in every case. And he's been very careful to talk about this interest not as being the overriding interest that will dictate what American foreign policy does, because he recognizes that there are competing interests out there for us in any given situation. So there's always going to be a tension, and any decision about intervention or even about prioritizing prevention, it may face competing interest questions. And every case will be made on its own merits in the context at the time.
Yeah, right there in the back.
I'll echo what he said in saying that the fact that the methodology is being adopted to make this consistent is a huge step forward. You talked a lot about the APB and the work as being very external facing as it relates to foreign policy. Does the APB look at things internally within the government from a foreign policy standpoint that critics of the United States government might define in the same way that you did earlier, let's say something like the drone program, that has seen similar levels based on your definition of civilian casualties over a sustained period of time? Does the APB look at those type of internal things in the same way as it's trying to affect change within the U.S. government?
I think the best way to answer that question is to say that questions of collateral damage related to the use of force are considered in the context of decisions about the use of force, and that the APB's mandate is to think about the intentional killing of large numbers of civilians that is purposeful and sustained over a short period of time. So they're quite distinct processes. That is not to suggest that the U.S. is not considering civilian implications of its use of force, regardless of the method by which that force is employed.
Karen, Kane?
Thank you very much. Given the difficulty and the gruesomeness of so many things that happen in this whole environment that you've identified, how do you talk about success without further politicizing or inflaming different groups of people in terms of what's going on?
One of the fundamental realities, as Ambassador Dalder said, is that you never know exactly how much success you had. So to me, I can, as a bureaucrat, I can measure success by saying we found $7 million. I can measure success by saying we deployed a conflict advisor. Or I can measure success by saying that, X number of students before and after this conflict resolution program felt this about this ethnic group that they used to want to kill. So there are varying degrees by which you can measure it. But, at the end of the day, the Nigerian elections are a great case in point. The credit belongs to the Nigerians, right? And so we are supporting players, but that doesn't mean that our role is unimportant. And so I am comfortable with an internal process that asks whether or not we're doing everything we feasibly can. But the challenge, particularly when you're talking about trying to galvanize external support or support from the Hill, is that you want to be able to tell a very fulsome story. And so it is a fine line, and so I tend, and I hope I manage to do that in my examples, I tend to offer a personal opinion that we have made a difference while giving the the prima facie evidence about what we have done. And at the end of the day, this is part of the reason why preventive work is chronically under-resourced and underappreciated. And it is a real dilemma. And if you think from a strategic perspective about the United States as a global leader, but a global leader with finite resources in a world in which the chronic humanitarian needs only continue to increase, we simply have to start thinking in a more preventive way. But most of our instincts and our processes and our budget allocations are not geared toward that. And so I have really made prevention, whether it's the prevention of violent extremism, the prevention of atrocities, as a fundamental focus for all the bureaus that I oversee as an undersecretary, because as a functional undersecretary, I am a bit removed from the day-to-day of everything else that's going on, and I want our team to be thinking over the horizon about the strategic plays for the United States. And prevention has got to be elevated, and so I see that as what is known as the J Bureau can really fruitfully take on behalf of the President's admonition, but as well as, what I think the American people would want, which is the biggest impact on the world at the lowest cost for the greatest good. And that's where I think prevention comes in.
Bill Mahoney, right here.
Yep, it's coming. Okay. Kind of a reverse engineering question. I actually was part of a delegation last year that went to Rwanda for the 20th year commemoration of the genocide. And we heard a lot about, obviously, issues about our response and the international response, and also a little bit about the prevention. And a constant theme we heard was we didn't understand how bad it was in advance, and we didn't understand how bad it was as it was occurring. Today, knowing how this board operates, if that board your board had been in existence then, with the means and methods you are using now, would we have been in a better position to prevent and or respond to Rwanda 20 years ago? Because that would tell me that it really does have the potential to be effective.
Yeah, the only problem is I have to give you a subjective answer. and as a government official, I have to say hypotheticals are not where we want to go. So I think it's hard to answer that question. I would like to think so.
Under today's, I'm not a government official, so I can say something. In the circumstances that occurred in 1994 versus the circumstances today is a key determinant, in addition to the APB, which is to say the violence that had happened in Bosnia and Haiti and Somalia had a huge influence about how we looked at what was happening in Rwanda. If you don't have the same background violence today, you might have a different view. But what the APP does, or it ought to be able to do, is to start breaking through the prior concerns and therefore frankly not looking at where you were supposed to be looking, because the mandate of a group is now to look at where you're supposed to look. So in that sense, there may be reason to think why a bureaucratic structure, which for anybody who's lived in bureaucracies knows how important it is, to have a structure that is mandated to say, no, you got to look at what's happening in the day, not within the context that it takes place, ought to give you more hope that under these circumstances you would have prevented it. So I can say that. And you don't have to. And all the way in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, Undersecretary Sewell. It's great to have you in Chicago. So when you mentioned your team is trying to think several steps down or several moves down the chessboard in advance of conflict, it's taken about 20 years to get the first 3 billion people on the planet on the internet. It's probably going to take less than 10 to get the next 3 billion people on the internet. Presumably those 3 billion that are not yet on but going to be on soon are some of the people you're trying to protect and some of the people who are most highly likely to be affected by mass killings and so on. Have you guys started thinking about how you're going to incorporate the internet, social media, and all that type of stuff into what you're doing in the future?
It's a great question. I think there is more attention played to the role of social media in fomenting violence than there is in peace building. And I think that is an underexplored area, in part because if I can offer a personal opinion, I think so much of the peace building community thinks in terms of personal relationships. And so isn't necessarily the tech-driven prism through which one then approaches the field of conflict resolution. But I think you've identified a really interesting and important challenge for us as we think about essentially, mass conflict prevention. And so I'll have to take that back and think more about it. And if you have ideas, you should email me. Thank
It's
you.
a great public-private enterprise thing, where the public is you and the private is the tech community. I think it's a very good question. Over here in the back.
What is the role of the private sector in helping to advance the APB in terms of resources, helping to develop mechanisms of alternative dispute resolution, but also engaging and reaching foreign publics to help enhance this as a viable future and present tool of diplomacy?
So I don't think there are any approved government talking points on this particular question. So I'm gonna see what I can do based on some of the work that we've been doing on the preventing violent extremism front. First of all, I think the business community has, in my opinion, a huge impact to make on the public discourse about the importance of stability in the globe. And I don't often hear the business community speaking up on behalf of the kinds of foreign assistance resources that I think are so crucial for that stability. To the extent that the business community can recognize that the investments in not just the military side of the house, but the non-military side of the house are critical components of enabling markets to operate, of promoting a rule of law context in which businesses can have confidence in their ability to function, of helping to improve global workforces so that there is both a greater choice for business development opportunity, but also the emergence of markets internationally. All that great self-interest stuff, I think, could find a voice through the business community that is very much needed in a time in which stability seems to be challenged in many ways. And so I think because the business community is so respected in the context of international affairs, and because the vibrance of the American economy and the degree of entrepreneurship of which we're so proud are in many ways the leading edge of U.S. foreign policy, I think there is a huge role there for just engagement in this discussion. I think you've probably heard it ad nauseum here at the council. I know that you all don't believe this, but the American people on the whole think that the amount of foreign aid that we spend is huge, when in fact it's embarrassingly small by OECD standards. And we're in a world in which China's developing an Asia Development Bank that fundamentally challenges, in some ways, the architecture of international economics as it's been practiced since the end of the last World War. It's a time when America needs to be engaged more than ever. It's a time when we need resources and energy to do that. And it's very hard if we have a public discourse that doesn't recognize that American leadership hinges on being able to engage in those ways. It's very difficult to do just about anything in foreign policy, let alone the atrocity prevention work. On the more narrow side of atrocity prevention, I think that that if there is not as, I don't want to boil this all down to resources, but I do think that it's very difficult when we have so many current needs that are enormous to think about protecting resources to make investments, essentially, in prevention. And that is just a significant barrier. Perhaps the whole business vernacular of return on investment and talking about prevention in that way, talking about foreign assistance and the State Department and AID as that, is the biggest single sort of force multiplier for a community that is so central to American power and influence across the globe.
Right there in the back.
Along those lines, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the opportunities to increase participation with local NGOs in some of these places that have high risk of mass atrocities across the board, but also women's NGOs, given the high prevalence of gender-based violence in many of these locations.
That is a great question, and I'm going to broaden the response slightly because President Obama just hosted a White House summit on countering violent extremism, in which the fundamental tenor of the discussion about violent extremism was the need for dramatically expanding the tools that we used to counter it and dramatically expanding the partners that we enlisted to counter it. And civil society, this was a really unique event because it was 60 plus ministerial level participants, and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was there, and all the very important international mucky-mucks. But there were also representatives from civil society for some 50 countries, and private sector folks, two dozen private sector folks from Google or the World Economic Forum. And so the conversation was very different. The conversation was very people-centered, and the conversation was how do we create community resilience? How do we address the terrain, the underlying factors from which violence flows? And so there, I think it's opposite to this question about mass atrocities, just in the same way that it's opposite to the question of violent extremism. The reality is that we need to think about civil society organizations not as instruments of foreign policy, but as partners in foreign policy. And I was just speaking to the Sister Cities program folks here in Chicago about ways in which we might be able to partner with that community here in Chicago, which then has links to civil society organizations in many other partner cities. I think this is part of this amazing transformation that I frankly had not anticipated when I went to the State Department, which is that we are now beginning to try to conduct layered diplomacy where it is not just about our government interlocutors, it is about people, and it is about the civil society organizations that represent people. When we think about violent extremism, when we think about the host of interventions that we need, the White House summit basically was saying, governments are responsible for these underlying conditions, but it's not always what they're not doing, it's often what they are doing. And so they need to think about political exclusion. They need to think about heavy-handed tactics on the part of security forces. They need to think about, why it is that certain parts of the country or certain communities don't have economic or educational opportunities that then makes them vulnerable to violence of whatever stripe it is. And similarly, the role of civil society organizations, particularly women, not so much from the gender-based violence perspective, but from the perspective of being early warning indicators and being preventive mechanisms within their own communities, all parents for that matter. But a host of different ways in which civil society can elevate and protect moderate voices, can build networks of communities such that they are able to better create an identity that's resistant to the notion that violence can divide them, as opposed to seeing their collective strength as being against violence. It's a whole new world out there. It's one in which we don't necessarily have the vernacular and the processes to engage it fully, but I think the White House Summit was a great example of how we are groping toward that, because we recognize that state-based solutions are not sufficient for dealing with the kinds of problems, whether they are epidemiological epidemics or whether they are civil war and insurgency. And so the role for people to people, for community to community, for community to government, strengthening in support of these peace and stability goals, I think is going to be one of the central structural challenges for our foreign policy, for sort of international security policy over the next decades. And it's very exciting to see that the State Department is grappling with that, but it's still a work in progress. And the violent extremism moniker and the whole notion of trying to enlist a full full set of layered actors in dealing with the problem set and involving them all in that discourse about how to do it and the programmatics for doing it, I think is really auspicious. I'm very excited about that. So stay tuned for the UN General Assembly in September, because there are a bunch of regional summits happening now on the way to UNGA, and hopefully we're going to see civil society coming with some really interesting proposals and greater relevance for that struggle going forward.
Sarah, you spent your life focused on preventing violence, and you've been a pioneer in bureaucratic innovation. You were the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of Defense for peacekeeping. You're now creating this, hopefully not too large, but very important undersecretary position, and you're running the APB, or being part of the APB, another bureaucratic innovation. I think the combination of bureaucratic innovation and success with a commitment to prevention gives us all of here a good reason to believe that we may well succeed. So thank you very much for being with us, for all you're doing serving our country in your current position and in the positions you have in the past. You're always welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
I'm not going back to Washington. So if you were to come over here, you're always welcome. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks
Please
for
join
having
me
me.
and thank you, Sarah.